Welcome to the discussion. My guest today is Jack Miller, the head of global professional services for Menlo Security. Jack, welcome to the discussion.
Hey, Jason, thanks a lot for having me here.
Let me set a little context for our conversation today. We've all heard the stories about how the move to remote work during the pandemic has increased the threat surface among agencies and the private sector. As employees worked from home on a more permanent basis, concerns definitely rose about personal Wi-Fi, home computers, other devices that we'll say may not have been as secure as what they use in the office. But the conventional wisdom that says this decentralized access leads to greater cyber risk, it doesn't have to be the case. Agencies can open up access to improve employee mission success while retaining visibility into network and application performance and limit cyber risks. Agencies can take tangible steps to further ensure employees can access data and applications from anywhere at any time, while also lowering their exposure to cyber threats. Now, what are those steps? Well, that's where my guest comes in. Once again, my guest is Jack Miller, the head of global professional services for Menlo Security. Jack, I just gave a really brief experience of that we've all had over the last year plus. So let's start with this idea of empowering the federal workforce, empowering any workforce, and how to deal with this idea of make sure that the information that they are using, the need for mission, does not differ from what they need to serve citizens. How do you find that right balance?
Yeah, so it's a tricky challenge that I think affects the federal government and organizations that are very security focused more than most other organizations out there, right? So historically, we look back over time, we saw that the way a lot of agencies addressed this was by implementing an air gap. And I remember years and years and years ago going into an FBI office, and they actually had two computers sitting on the desk, right? One for accessing internal systems and one for going to other places on the internet. Obviously, that causes challenges for productivity, right? But the problem is when you get rid of that and you go to one system, then what happens is we lock down access to things on the internet because we're too concerned about the risk that they might introduce. Right. So the ways we can address this and move forward is taking that same approach of an air gap, but really kind of making it more of a virtual air gap. Right. So we want to allow our employees to be able to access different things on the internet. We just want to do it in a way that we know that they're 100% protected when they're accessing those things.
All right, Jack, you open the door. I'll just walk through it. So how do you do it? Right. What is a virtual air gap? Let's start there. Describe what that means. And then, okay, so we got to do this. How do we do it?
Yeah. So, the devil's in the details, right? So the first thing is when we look back at our threat research, we see that the vast majority of attacks that are out there today are web-based attacks, right? So while there may be multiple steps to the kill chain, typically they'll usually start, or at some point along the kill chain, there will be a website that's involved, or it could be an email that's involved with a link that gets clicked on, right? And so what happens when you go to a website is that website runs a lot of code locally on your endpoint. And if you and the people watching this can do it, right? If you go to any website at all out there and then you right-click view source, right? You'll see all the code that's running locally on your computer. Well, that code may be bad. That code could be malicious. You may have vulnerabilities on your endpoint that code can leverage. And so with the physical air gap that had been implemented for many years, right, what was said was that we don't want that code to run on the endpoint because this endpoint is trusted, right? And we allow this endpoint to access our internal systems. So we gave employees another endpoint, a separate one that wasn't connected to the production network, that only had access to the internet, with the belief that it didn't matter if that endpoint got compromised. It didn't matter if it went out and it got malware and there was a vulnerability and it got rooted because it wasn't connecting to our internal systems. The challenge is that not only was that a really bad solution because it made it very difficult for our users to be efficient in what they're doing, having to switch back and forth, but the reality is that separate system that they used for an air gap over time really starts to become a critical production system. And so now what happens when that system is compromised because the websites you let it go to? The people were using those computers for a reason to support their work efforts, right? And if those systems are down or those systems are compromised, they're back in the same boat, right? So with virtual isolation, right, we do all this virtually. The clients connect to a surrogate browser that is either, it can be either on-prem or it can be in the cloud. And then that browser connects to the external website for you. All code from that website is run in the virtual browser, not in your browser on your desktop. It's just more or less kind of think of it as screenshots, right? It's kind of easiest to think of it in the old mainframe days, right? It's almost like you're at a reflections terminal, right? And you have this other system providing access for you. So, what we found is that we have two types of customers. One are customers that are not super locked down today. Fortunately for us, most of those are not in the federal space, right? So for them, it's how can we come in and really reduce the risk they have today by implementing the isolation for all the sites they're going to today. But then we have other customers that are very, very security focused, and they're very locked down today. So for instance, things like uncategorized websites, they don't allow access to. What we can do, or any other vendor that does virtualization for that matter could do, is we could say, look, for uncategorized websites, because that's a large risk area, we can virtualize those. So now we can give your employees access to those types of sites. So this kind of brings up the point you talked about, the difference in information, right? It becomes difficult when you're an employee. And some of this may be a lot more exacerbated in state and local government because there's more interactions maybe with the constituency. But when you're interacting with someone over the phone and they're looking at stuff and doing stuff and they're talking to you about it, but you can't see that information, or the information you see looks differently, it makes for a difficult conversation to make sure you're all on the same page. So by implementing some sort of virtual air gap or virtual isolation, suddenly we can start to allow the internal employees to access those same sites, even though those sites may be risky had they not been isolated.
It sounds to me like obviously you're describing something that the Defense Information Systems Agency put in place that you guys are a big part of, the cloud-based internet isolation program. This has been in many ways a huge success story for DISA, for the DoD. Can you give me any sort of kind of update about how that's going, in the sense of you've tested it, this works, and that's the virtual air gap you're talking about?
Yeah, it's I mean, we're in the process of doing the deployment right now with all the different mission partners. We do have several 100,000 people from different mission partners already on the platform today, and everything's working great. So it is tested and tried and true. Now, there's challenges to get there, like any kind of big project, right? There's a lift you have to get through, and by doing the proper planning up front and trying to have good pilot groups that are representative so we can identify issues before they become impactful to broad swaths of the organization, it helps move things along really quickly. The good news is for anybody doing a deployment of these types of technologies is that after you get through the initial hurdle, you do reach a level of homeostasis where everything kind of runs pretty smoothly after that. So it is going well. We've got a lot of excitement from the different mission partners. They're anxious to get on, and we're scrambling to try to support them. It's tough to do when you have such a large organization with so many people, but we're super happy to be engaged with them right now.
Appreciate the update on the DISA program. I know it's something that a lot of people are watching, so there's a lot of attention being paid to it because it's there's a lot of innovation happening. But it also brings up the bigger piece that people maybe not understand where the threats are coming from, or how to detect the threats, or maybe some misconceptions. Because as you mentioned, someone has to click on a link. That link takes you to a web browser. That's actually where the threat is, not the quote unquote link itself. So maybe walk me through a little bit about why this misconception exists around what the threats are, and then how to detect them.
Yeah, look, I think that historically going back, right, when you think of hacks, you think of in hackers, you think of these people that are really sophisticated and really advanced and really targeting the adversaries that they're going after. And this was really, I think, reinforced for a generation of us with movies like War Games and stuff like that, right? And the reality is that the way the attackers attack today is they even for targeted attacks, they try to have as big of an attack surface area as possible, because they never know where they can find that little area, that little hole that they can get in and get elsewhere. And so I think you've got this disconnect where most people seem to think like, look, I'm just here to do my job. Maybe I don't have access to top secret information, right? Maybe I'm kind of a lower level person, so why would anyone go after me? I'm just, I'm going to websites that are big companies out there, so obviously they're not compromised. I probably don't have to worry about them. And so there's a lot of, I think, assumptions that get made. And at the end of the day, that's kind of the difference between a security person and a non-security person is we're all kind of paranoid. And we look at that every interaction we have from our computer is a potential opportunity for an attacker to break in and take over and do bad things. And we try and we try and we try over the years to educate and train our workforce to make sure that they really understand this. And even if we can get some fundamental level of understanding, the workforce, the employees all still have their challenges that they need to deal with and their goals they need to accomplish. And they're under stress and pressure and timelines to get things done. And they're just trying to do their job. And so it loses focus, and it creates this opportunity where whether they're going to an unknown random website or they're going to, a large news organization, either of those websites could potentially host malicious software that could compromise them. So, at the end of the day, it's like, how can we, understanding that our employees are our employees and they're going to do what they're going to do, and we want to be able to enabling them to be as effective and efficient as possible, right? How can we implement controls that are seamless and transparent to them, that allow them to go to do their job, that allow them to once in a while make mistakes like everybody does, but still have them protected and covered at the same time, right? And that's why we really have to switch the approach. And you mentioned at the beginning of the conversation, remote work and how everything's changed and all these different devices, and it's just it compounds it, and it compounds it, and it compounds it, right? It's distracted drivers get in accidents, distracted employees, have bad things inadvertently happen to them when they're on the internet. I mean, it is kind of what it is, and it's the workforce we deal with today.
It's almost taken the human factor out of it because you're putting up, if you will, the seatbelts and the airbags and the sensors in the front to tell you to brake. It's giving you all these kind of the bubble around you, because as a human, you're going to make a mistake. So how do we protect you from yourself in many ways?
Exactly. You hit the nail on the head, right? If we can implement processes where we say it doesn't matter if someone makes a mistake, we're still safe. We're always going to be better off doing that, whether that's a combination of processes and technology than trying to think everybody's got to be perfect all the time, right? That the saying always goes, and I hate to be repetitive and say things that everybody watching this has heard a million times, is that we have to be right every time. The bad guy only has to be right once, right? Well, the flip side of that coin is that your employees have to be right every time, and they mess up only once. Is there a bad person there waiting to pounce? There's a good chance there might be, especially if they're working in a highly targeted industry or vertical.
All right, you opened the door for a great conversation in the next segment, I think, about zero trust. So we'll get there in a second. But first, let's take a quick break. You're listening to the discussion, Federal Work and Cyber Risk, Two Sides of the Same Coin, sponsored by Menlo Security on Federal News Network.